Joining me again, because the only explanation is that he's a masochist, is Dan McTeague. Listen, thank you very much for coming back.
Good to be here.
I'd like to start on the big question since the last time I chatted with you. This was the Supreme Court and the decision on not the carbon price, as they like to call it, but the carbon tax. Just give me your response to that decision.
Well, there's a lot of angles in which to attack it, but it appears that the great decision has been made on high by 6 justices who basically said all the traditions of jurisprudence and the way in which judgments have taken place in the past have been set aside in favor of political commentary. And in fact, surprisingly enough, I didn't know that our wonderful justices in Ermine were also climate experts and scientists at the same time. Who knew? But the reality is that the decision, even from a constitutional point, I think it's becoming rather apparent that liberties were taken, that traditional safeguards that were put in place by precedents and previous decisions have been set aside in order for this justice, particularly led by Justice Richard Wagner, as he would call himself, to basically establish a couple of very interesting things. First of all, global warming is vogue. I didn't know it was.
There was one, again, I'm not a lawyer and nor have I been in Parliament, but some of the statements on the pure matter, not of law, but on the theories or understanding of global warming, that it's an existential threat and that it's all, isn't that out of their province altogether to say those things?
Well, it is out of their jurisdiction. It's out of their ability to make those statements. I mean, you're entitled to your opinion, but how do they relate to the substance of what's at hand? I mean, the decision was, is this ultra virus, is what the federal government doing trampling on provincial jurisdiction or not? I think the province have said, yeah, climate change is real, big deal. What the justices didn't just basically throw away years of precedents in terms of deciding the limited use of the peace, order, and good government, the so-called residual power. They basically came to a policy decision and said, humans are responsible for global warming, and therefore we have to ensure that in the extreme, we have to allow the federal government to do whatever it wants. Carte blanche. I've never seen anything like that before, and I'm sure that there's a number of previous jurists of the Supreme Court who are probably rolling in their grave right now, wondering how the heck it could have been that justices would come to this kind of facile conclusion.
Well, not only that, down the road, at whatever point we have an election, it's obvious that that part of the decision, which is not on the legal point, that's the estimation of a judge or judges on the various theories and extent of so-called global warming. But it's going to be in all the heavy literature from the government that the Supreme Court has also said the science is settled. I mean, it wanders into politics however you look at it.
It does, and it's a very dangerous journey. We have seen examples of this before where there has been concern about politicization of the courts. I note that the Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice himself, had attended a rather obscure group that was created a few years ago out of Montreal, CISD, I think they refer to it as, evidence that he had appeared before a committee and perhaps tarnished or challenged and compromised his judicial integrity by giving statements that are very similar to what we saw in terms of the decision. Now, the decision is very long and very complex, but it strikes me, I never saw previous justices do that. Certainly not Antonio Lemaire, certainly not Bora Laskin. You could never impugn or suggest that there was some kind of partiality to the decisions. They made decisions based on laws before them, and they didn't stray. I mean, traditionally, we've used peace, order, and good government as very limited, as I mentioned earlier, only in cases where it was abundantly clear that there was no issue of provincial jurisdiction. I'm concerned that even provinces like British Columbia, which cheered this on, but the year before was opposing the federal government strenuously in terms of imposing the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Quebec, civil rights and property, that's now up for grabs. I don't think the provinces that might be cheering on the idea of carbon taxes or an imposition, a financial imposition, or sorry, we can't call it carbon taxes. We have to call it a regulatory charge.
Okay.
All of these things really underline and underscore the fact, yes, the federal Liberals and their friends in the NDP and the Green and the Bloc now have a significant weapon at their disposal, but they basically subverted the very constitution of the country and allowed individuals who I think I have very much to answer for. And I won't go on a great length. It's not the first time I've taken on a justice of the Supreme Court, Rosalie Abella, before she became and wore the ermine back in 2002. I challenged her on her forward-looking infrared decision when she was in the Court of Appeal, and she was chief of the Court of Appeal of Ontario. And she had to believe that that particular piece of instrument used to, heat signatures to find people who were lost or marijuana grow-ups, et cetera, that this was an infringement on the charter. I asked the then Minister of Justice, Cochon, along with Jean Chrétien, in fact, it was a tough battle inside caucus, to get them to at least appeal her decision, because it basically had the effect of removing an important tool for policing this country. To my great delight, an 8-0 decision, not 9, because she had not become the justice. She was replacing someone. They rejected her paired reasoning. So not the first time I've had my concerns legally about justices, but in this case, I'm extraordinarily alarmed, and everyone else should be.
Well, it's also interesting. You mentioned the Liberals, the Greens, the NDP, but I'm looking at Mr. O'Toole. He kind of stands aside from the carbon tax because that's a killer, but he's still online, if I can be just blunt about it. Oh, global warming is a big problem and Canada has to do, meet its emissions. I mean, is there any room at all left for the discussion, debate, and resistance to this thing?
Not in Canada, apparently, according to the established parties currently sitting in the House of Commons. But I think when people begin to understand the magnitude and the totality of the rather suspicious information and data, and of course, political gamesmanship that has gone into providing and conniving people into believing that there is only one possible outcome here, that climate is not something that is simple. It requires several disciplines. There is no conclusive evidence that man-made carbon emissions are leading to global warming or to climate change. Yes, there is an issue of the climate change, but I think in the case of Mr. O'Toole, he's probably believed, and incorrectly so, and I say I'll put my 18 years in line as a member of parliament in the 905, that you can somehow defend and say you need to proceed in this direction while at the same time giving people the impression that you're not going to tax them. Somehow, some way, people are going to wind up paying for this. And unfortunately for a cool country like Canada, it's far more severe. And for Mr. O'Toole, it may create some confusion. In fact, I think he's going to lose support, not gain support, among his very strength, his very important elements of support.
I think he will too. There's a question. I mean, it's so obvious, at least it is to me, that even if you believe, and it's the apocalyptic scenario you're asked to believe, that the world will end unless we here in Canada do something, we're such a trivial contributor, if this were true, trivial contributor to the problem. And the massive states of this world, and China and India, etc., are, again, superlatively larger than us. So why is Canada lacerating itself for its petty influence over a problem that's dubious to begin with, and stirring up strife between the provinces and the federal government? What's the obsession about?
Well, I think the obsession is that there is no counter, and what is countered as fact and reality is not given an opportunity to be discussed. We created Canadians for Affordable Energy over the past few years. I left my work at Gas Buddy to take up the idea that we need to really focus on where the energy and affordability in this country is going, and our ability to maintain our standard of living, and which you and I discussed in our last segment. I think what has happened is that for a good number of Canadians, there has been a disconnect between the price of these things, the total cost of these things. No cost benefit analysis done. Hey, yeah, I'm all for the environment, but if the cost outweighs the benefit, then why would I want to get onto that? And by the way, if we're talking environmentalism, we're only talking about one very small fraction. Carbon, we're not talking about air pollution. CO2 is seen as the only dog that gets the attention of government and of people. But more importantly, have we become so involved and engrossed in the idea, the constant barrage on climate change, that we have lost track of what $1 billion, what $1 trillion is, what losing our financial wherewithal is amidst this, this economic bubble that we find ourselves in, especially on the housing side. I won't talk about that just yet, but it's critical that I think we understand that we have a generation of people who've had it really good. I don't want to use a Harold Macmillan from Britain in the 1960s. You've never had it so good. But I think it's also blinded us to the reality of the things that make Canada unique, make us wealthy, and it completely obliviates and obscures the great thing has been done in Canada towards clean energy. This is not a new concept for Canadians. We've had clean energy for generations.
We've had the majority of the infrastructure in this country, so much of its wealth, so many of its social services has come from the exploitation, and that's the right word to use,
Yeah.
of natural resources. I cannot think of another country that has the tremendous inheritance of natural wealth that turns against its own central advantage and advertises to the world that it has an almost suicidal determination to shut down the very things that have made you as prosperous and as unhealthy as it is. There's something here. I don't understand the psychology behind this mortification exercises, sackcloth and ashes. Our oil industry is destroying the world. Where does this come from?
Well, not even dogs will soil their own kennel. The reality, I think, has been it has become as a result of not being challenged. Perhaps folks like me should have been involved 10, 15 years ago with our school curriculums, in which one-sided views were accepted as truth. There is, of course, a significant amount of room for debate, but debate was put aside. And that's what makes, by the way, the Supreme Court decision so vile. It has basically said, pay up and shut up. That's what the Supreme Court has said in concert with the people that appointed them. I'm sorry, with the process that got them there. But let's be honest. I mean, Mr. Trudeau had a lot to do with making Mr. Wagner the Chief Justice, and he has appointed several members. That's not to say that there is a complete partisan bias, but there certainly is when it comes to certain issues. Now, I think where Canadians stand on this, they've had an opportunity to take these things for granted and not really understood our history. We know more about climate change and the apparent evils of our fossil fuels than we know about the history, the geography of this country, the very prohibitive climate in which we live in. And if that weren't enough, we've gone through some of the coldest, harshest temperatures we've seen in a long time. And no one takes account of these things, probably because many of us are too busy trying to make ends meet, dealing with the real crisis, not the made up one, the climate emergency that you keep hearing. And it's not just, by the way, the federal government or the Supreme Court. Municipalities here in Ontario are doing the same thing. Oh, we endorsed a climate emergency a year and a half ago. So we'll shut down our natural gas. This really defies any sensible logic that people would actually take the very thing that maintains their standard of living, that keeps them healthy, that keeps them wealthy, and discard it because apparently there are other alternatives. Well, we bought the idea. Unfortunately, fish hook, line, and sinker.
You make an extremely good point, and it's not just the provincial governments and the provincial municipalities. It's it's the school boards. It's in the schools. It's this climate change virtue signaling that begins even at the level of grade 1 and grade 2. It seems to be the most available topic for people to kind of expand their moral waistline, and everybody wants to have something. We're going to ban plastic forks in some high ski resort in Alberta, lest it get into the ocean. In some ways, this thing is almost a lunatic thing. But then if you oppose it, you get called the most savage of names and the immense slur linking you to the Holocaust of denial. By the way, there's one more. I know it's tired, but it has to be always brought up. This campaign is really antagonizing so many people in some of the Western provinces that eventually it will cause some problems in the Confederation.
Well, it is causing problems in the Confederation. And the first blip of that is going to become pretty self-evident on April 19th, when, like it or not, the Trudeau government has to provide and deliver a budget. And unless they're prepared to fudge the numbers, it appears that the West is no longer in a position where it can continue to provide the financial structure that has allowed provinces like Quebec and the Maritimes and Ontario, to a lesser extent, to continue to take advantage of the equalization formula. We're all in very deep trouble, and the very time in which you need the provinces that have done very well for us in the past, getting us out of the 2008, I'll say that, the economic downturn that we saw in 2008, the economic downturn that we saw in 1995. One of the saving graces Canada had was its ability to sell its resources to a waiting, ready market in the United States. And not only have we cut off pipelines and engaged in those kind of shenanigans that Americans are and their green friends are now, salivating over. And we'll see that, by the way, here in Ontario in about 42 days, when Gretchen Whitmer and her Democrat green friends shut down Line 5. I digress. I think what's happened here is that we're looking at a real circumstance where the economic engines that are able to get our economy back up and right and to right the ship to deal with the real crisis are pretty much fundamentally, pretty much cut away.
It's not a side point at all. Explain for a more general audience the situation in Line 5. People who follow this issue obviously know a fair bit about it, but just unfold it. And what's your prognosis? Is Michigan going to do this? Just go ahead.
Yeah, Michigan is going to do this. It's going to try to do this. Our saving grace might be that the courts will hold it up. But I have since, and in fact, I tweeted this yesterday, I remember twice speaking to colleagues I've known for 20 years in the Canadian press. And I said, based on my older work, meeting with officials, emergency officials in Michigan, in Ohio, Pennsylvania, they would all come to me after we gave our presentation on outage trackers and things like that we did with Gas Buddy and say, you have a real problem and we're very concerned. We're concerned here in our state that the government is going to shut down Line 5. But you should be even more concerned because most of that oil is going right back into the Ontario and Quebec, propane, et cetera. So why isn't your government engaged in this? That is both the provincial and federal. And up until the crisis occurred on November 13th when Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, and no insignificant governor, by the way, just understand that she is the vice chair of the Democratic Convention. So she wields a lot of power beyond her own state. Basically made a decision, long time coming, that they were going to ask and tell Enbridge, the owner of the pipeline that crosses the Straits of Mackinac, brings all that Alberta oil, 540,000 barrels, much of it into Ontario, that is effectively, they no longer have the right of way. And they're saying, doesn't matter what you do, we want it closed. No one has pushed back at this point. Enbridge is saying, yeah, well, we're nuts to you. We're not going to obey. But if the National Guard is deployed and state officials are brought in to shut that down, they will have to shut it down. What are the alternatives? Well, someone said to me, rail, navigable waters, and all these things are wonderful, except that they, increase not only the carbon footprint, there's the irony. Where are you going to get your diesel if your refineries that make that diesel are shut down in Sarnia and Nanticoke? Where are you going to get your propane? Where are you going to, this is going to be a real mess. And the effect of which, Rex, very bluntly, would be if you can find gasoline, look for it to go from $1.20 a liter, which is what it is today, easily to $2 a liter, and look for the impact, the knock-on effect to the petrochemical sector, to the plastic sector, the styrene sector. You're going to look at tens of thousands of jobs knocked out and a lot of people without fuel. So thankfully, it'll happen in May. My concern is not so much whether it's going to happen or not. I've said it's 50-50 many times. My concern is that this is going to happen sooner or later. We should be reviving Energy East, but this is not something that Trudeau cares about, Mr. O'Toole cares about, certainly Mr. Singh, Jagmeet Singh cares about, or whoever the Green official is. They really don't care, but someone's got to have the public's back. And apparently there is no one in Ottawa with that interest right now.
It is truly a curious thing, and especially when you consider, and we'll go back to something else you've just slightly alerted me to. We've had a year and a bit now of this so-called COVID crisis, and we've had the greatest expenditures of money that we've ever seen in the history of Confederation. At the same time, simultaneously with the decimation of Canadian businesses of all types and sizes because of the shutdown itself. When this thing lifts and when the debt is put on the table again, where's the relief? Where does the new money come from at the same time as we're savaging one of our central industries?
An era of austerity, is staring us right in the face. High prices, less jobs, fewer opportunities. Governments are going to have to tax. And make no mistake, if first anyone doesn't believe that there was an accident that StatsCan and Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation did not, look for the
I'm
$250,000
glad you brought it up.
program to start taxing people's estate, start taxing and removing that exemption on their primary residence, you're fooling yourselves, because it's coming. Sure as a fire bell in the night, to use an American expression. But the question is, what will be left? Who will be left standing when this government says, rather than dealing with the pandemic, rather than dealing with excessive spending, some of it's warranted, stuff before it would not. Remember, we're $115 billion in debt before we got this, since the Trudeau government took over, when it said we would have a balanced budget. That aside, when you have no jobs, no industry, no one wants to make investments, and you're imposing regulations, not just on the oil and gas sector, but on manufacturing and on farmers.
Yes.
There really isn't a lot of
Yes.
other areas to go to. And I caution everybody, we are living in a surreal bubble right now, in which things seem okay. We're more concerned about, what happens in terms of the number of people who come down
Yes.
with COVID on a day-to-day. That's understandable. But no one's looking to what's going to really happen. And in the midst of this, we know the federal Liberals are going to call an election a sneaky one, try to suppress the information, but all hell is about to break loose, and it's going to hurt Canadians for generations to come.
I agree with the central point that you're making, that the flushing out of the 400, 500, 600 billion dollars in a single year, and the numbing circumstance of COVID itself, which operates, apart from every other medical problem, it's a vast distraction from everything else.
Yeah.
And that we're building ourselves a crisis in a year or two or three that no political party is willing to speak about, because it's going to be so huge. By the way, I don't think too many, because Blacklocks was the one that originated the news on this, that CMHC, Canadian Mortgage, had done this kind of hidden study about taxing the sale of a private house. Just again, for the sake of those who haven't followed, just give me the outline of that as well.
Well, look, it was no secret for anyone who filed their taxes over the past few years. There was a section that you had to tick off if you happened to be selling your own home. It was voluntary, but of course required you to disclose whether or not you had sold your home. Mm-hmm. So in that time, of course, not much attention was paid to it. About a year or so ago, Blacklock's reporter, Mining Ottawa, had revealed that there had been a request by Canada Mortgage and Housing, a $250,000 grant given to Simon Fraser University, or University of British Columbia, I think it's University of British Columbia, to give an analysis of the impact of what would happen if the federal government were to tax or remove the exemption which you currently have on the sale of your primary residence, currently an exemption. Now, this is not a new issue, Rex. I talked about it last time. I mean, I go back to the days when Joe Clark brought this in 1979, tax mortgage deductibility, and it made people out it was great as it was in the United States. But this would be a real significant transition at a time when people are saying, hey, I've made money. I'm going to make money on my own home. It's my only prize and possession that I have. Government can't touch it. Government is now clearly eyeing it. And CMHC has denied that they, in fact, did pay this amount. But it turns out that not just Mining Ottawa and Blacklock's reporter, same organization, but also the Canadian Taxpayers Federation has confirmed that this is the case. So why this isn't front page news, I don't know. But I can tell you, 905, everybody owns their home. 416, a lot of people own their home. Right across the country, home ownership is the gold standard by which we measure our standard of living. If you're going to mess with that, even to suggest you're going to mess with it suggests to me that at a time when governments are going to be desperate for money and funding, not just federal, provincial, municipal, unfunded pensions, there really is very little option. I would consider it a guarantee that within 1 year, the declaration will be made by the federal government, whoever that should be, that there will be, in fact, a removal of that exemption. Canadians should best be prepared for it, especially those who vote for it.
I would also, just as a rider to that, if it ever comes to it, it is not an issue you will see raised in an election. It will be a tax that is imposed after the majority is secured.
Yeah. Be aware of it. And someone said to me, well, what's your game in this? As I mentioned before, I worked for the many generations ago. My first break on the hill was working for the Minister for Canada Mortgage and Housing. And it's not an accident. These things are not done happenstance. And while it may not be politically palatable, there may be no choice. And of course, it'll be argued, and I can see it right now. Well, generations of children. I have 5 at home, ranging between 14 and 25. One married with children, can't find a home. even if they were qualified, they can't get it. That is going to be the excuse. That is going to be used the trigger and say, you can't do this to the next generation. You're denying them the opportunity to have a home. So this form of taxation is going to be seen as a guilting, as we saw with carbon taxes, as a guilting of people who have owned their home, even though you happen to be someone who's owned your home for 50 years, worked all of your life, paid those mortgage payments, despite the 12, 13, 14% that you might have had to go through for an extended period of time. That's going to be set aside because the government now needs to reach much deeper into your pocket and fleece you.
Mr. McTeague, I'm going to cite some stuff that I found on your various postings. It concerns why Canada is the lead player in the great climate crusade when the two largest, population-wise, the two largest countries in the world, and certainly the major economies next to America, India and China. Here's one from your post on India. India says it can't bind itself to net zero targets because, quote, it would entail astronomical costs. Secondly, it would require a complete transformation and would derail the development plans of all of India. That's India. China, they're off the hook till 2030 anyway, when they originally promised at 2030 they'd get onto this carbon game, but now they've cleared that up as well. China has no carbon cap, it has no carbon taxes, it has no plan to phase out the use of coal whatsoever, and it has absolutely no intention of drawing up a roadmap for combating global warming. Now, that's India, that's China. So if the two great economies, and certainly the most populous countries in the world, are offside on this and have no intention of getting onside, why are we here in trivial Canada crucifying our main industry to pursue a vain target?
Very good questions, but I think it's the institutionalization in Canada of virtue signaling. You want to be able to say to the rest of the world you can do better than they can, while the rest of the world saying, be our guest. You want to deindustrialize, be our guest. You want to cause punishing costs and prohibitive costs to your consumers as well as to your residents. We're not going to stop you. But I think these countries are taking a far more pragmatic approach and saying, energy affordability and fossil fuels and hydrocarbons are a reality that has improved the standard of living of every person on this planet, not taken away or somehow destroyed this. Whereas the narrative in Canada, based on a very false premise that somehow CO2, an inert gas, is so bad that we have to basically twist ourselves into pretzels and destroy the very country that we have and put aside all the great things that we've done, much less recognize we're not just a resource-rich country, we're also, again, an extremely cold country that requires fossil fuels and the use of hydrocarbons responsibly done. All those things have been set aside. We had this discussion earlier, but I think it's critical that we understand that Canada can continue to lash itself as much as it wants. The reality is it's not going to change anything, but it is going to bring about an era of misery in this country, the likes of which we have not seen. Now, I'm not making these bold assertions because I think there's something to say and it's the only way to fearmonger is the way to do it. No, I do this on years and years of examining these things and recognizing that when you shed the very things that have made this country unique and profitable and prosperous, when you get rid of those things, you have nothing left. And you don't even have the international bragging rights as you sit around, international forum, many of which I sat at. Recalling, I was brought in as a privy councillor to handle the affair of Canadians abroad, swilling canapes, eating canapes and swilling back Perrier. Never mind the bragging rights, and let's get practical. Sooner or later, Canadians are going to recognize that they need a government that's committed to them, not to these grandiose, ridiculous ideas that somehow you can change the world by destroying yourself.
Yeah. I'll bring it to a close by another quotation because I think it states the theme of the struggle. I'm not optimistic, incidentally, to be straight on it, that any real fight back on this has much chance of success because the propagandization has gone so deep, and certainly the obsession of the current government on this one particular topic is so fixed that they're likely to change. But here's the quote from yourself, and I agree with it 100%. The anti-carbon tax fight requires a pushback against the establishment interests who have a platform, and this is very key. They have a platform in mainstream media and elsewhere. I mean, if you look at CBC, TV Ontario, they're vested advocates. Global warming is the church view of that particular one. You also say it requires a pushback against the slew of policy wonks who like to say carbon taxes make such sense. And it requires a pushback against the many people who insult everyday Canadians who are sick and tired of watching their taxes go up. Here's the ringer. We're in COVID. We've had the businesses of the country closed down. And the only new tax that has been visited on Canadians is this virtue tax of carbon. Your thought to wind her up.
Just not to make too fine a point of it, though, not forgetting members of Parliament helped themselves to yet another increase. But for the second time in this pandemic, we see two very things that would be considered contemptuous in the past and absurd, to say the least. Look, I think we have to recognize that those who are advocating these things and don't want anybody
from
else.
Their results.
Well, of course, but they're paid. They're well paid. I don't care what organization you happen to belong to. Look at the amount of tax money that is given out to organizations to advocate for these changes that are both pernicious to our future and very dishonest about the use of our energy to ensure not only our adequacy as to make ends meet day to day, but also to be able to export and to receive a decent return for these things. What we have in this country is an institutionalized form of those holding their hands out for more tax money to justify what they're saying. Ask someone in an academic community what would happen if they produced a paper tomorrow saying climate change is not correct, or that somehow carbon taxes, punishing people, forcing them to pay, is not the way to go about it. Watch what happens. Not a single penny would be given to you. You would be ostracized, obviously. So look, it is very much advanced. We're very much into the final hours, I think, of those who have basically wanted control over civilization using climate extremism, or what I call climate bedwetting, as a means of justifying their position. But the truth is coming out. The public will understand the very deep depression that we put ourselves in financially because we've gone along with this. There is a cost to our ignorance, being oblivious, and those things which have shielded us in the past, the government's ability to spend money to get rid of a problem, those days are coming to an end. And I think it's high time the public really recognizes and prepares itself. If nothing else, the truth that we've given, that we've told, is there and manifest for anybody to take advantage of it and to understand there is another side of the story. And unfortunately, our ignorance up to this point is going to have a dramatic and significant and extraordinary cost for everybody.
Well, I hope that some people are listening to you, and I would hope that the politicians who nominally are in opposition, and also the leaders and executives in the various industries are there, would start to say their mind on these things. The timidity surrounding this issue is in some ways disgusting. Dan McTeague, I much appreciate, as I said at the very beginning, you showing up masochistically for a second. It's always a treat to talk to you. Thank you very much.
It's been a distinct pleasure. Thanks for having me once again, Rex.